guys have have more expertise on some issues than I do. So I'll introduce myself and then kind of lay out a few what I see as the very primary concerns, and
Yep.
then end with an encapsulation of the article, an abridged version of which Donald's kindly sent out to everybody, and then I'd love to just do a Q&A forum type of discussion.
Right. Excellent.
Um, obviously, everybody knows who I am. I'm communications director for Canada's largest pro-life organization, the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. We are committed to exposing the injustice of abortion across Canada, and we have a reach of about 4 million every year right now. This June, we'll have over 80 people on payroll, and every day we are putting boots on the ground, showing people the truth about abortion and seeing minds changed. And that's one of the key reasons that in all of the recent data, the most pro-life group of Canadians in this country are those born after 1988, those born after the R.V. Morgenthaler decision. And so we are genuinely starting to see a shift amongst younger people on the abortion issue. The polling indicates now that the most pro-abortion group in Canada's population are people over the age of 65, which is a fairly safe age to be pro-abortion in my view. The young people are those that we're trying to reach out to. And Tristan Hopper asked on the National Post last year, why is it that in so much of Western Europe, abortion is becoming a non-issue, where in Canada, it seems to become more and more of an issue each year, and more people are tilting towards the pro-life perspective. And I would argue that's because we're seeing thousands upon thousands of conversations, one-on-one conversations, door to door, street to street happening every day in this country. And we're committed to continuing to do that until we see a cultural tipping point reached.
Right.
So that's my day job. In terms of the European Conservative that was mentioned, I also write for a variety of different publications, all on cultural issues. I teach a culture war course to all of the interns that we have every year. And the purpose of that course is essentially to answer the question how we got here, which
Right.
is the title of my next book, which is coming out in October.
Okay.
And so I start with the sexual revolution, which essentially transformed our civilization in fundamental ways that we are still beginning to fully understand now. Our society, Western civilization, that is to say, was rooted in Judeo-Christian values, which is to say that the premises of our civilization were rooted in scriptural revelation. And post the 1960s sexual revolution, we now root the premises of our civilization in sexual revolution as opposed to revelation. And all of the various conflicts we see going on that we refer to as the culture war are in fact conflicts brought about by the shift that we're seeing from revelation to revolution. And so the battles over religious liberty and the battles over identity in the courts, this is simply the legal regime moving to begin to enshrine the tenets of the new ideology. We see this unfold in cultures such as Hollywood. The heroes of our culture are now people like Alfred Kinsey, who had a biopic starring Liam Neeson. Gloria Steinem had 2 movies about her released recently. What we're seeing is the sexual revolutionaries who transformed our culture are now taking the place in the pantheon of heroes that were once occupied by Christians. I always say in a sane country, Ted Byfield would have gotten the Order of Canada and would have been recognized as one of the most successful journalists, the only Western Canadian to launch a successful magazine. Dr. George Grant, Donald, who you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
once said the only people in Western Canada doing something worth doing are the Byfields. But of course, because he was on the wrong side of the revolution we're referring to, he is only remembered as a footnote in history books written by people who hate him and think that people like him and like us needed to be removed in order to get on with the revolution. And so,
I might just add, John, you've got a book on Byfield. That's you've got it right there. Okay. So excellent. That's a great man for sure.
yes, no, it was having the opportunity to write that book and spend all of that time with him is one of the most special things that I got to do. I am a huge, unashamed admirer of him. I wrote the book because I thought he was a social conservative hero, and because I think that in our culture, in a post-Christian culture, and as Aaron Wren says, an anti-Christian culture, the very people who fought against the changes we see coming about are demonized as the villains of the story.
Right.
And if we don't tell our own stories, nobody's going to. And so there were people more qualified to write a biography of Ted than me. I think he knew every writer in the country at some point,
Yeah.
but nobody else was willing to do it. And so I did it because I thought it was a story that was worth telling, and one that had a lot of
Right.
lessons for us.
Right.
So when it comes to the cultural issues, I write for First Things almost monthly. I'm a contributing
That's right.
editor for the European Conservative. I write for World Magazine. And just, yeah, what I could bore you with the list, but
Right. Is that,
Mhm.
oh, sorry, is Marvin Olasky involved with that?
He was the founder of World Magazine. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I
Yeah,
do know.
I reviewed his most recent book on the abortion wars for the American Conservative. Actually, it was a brilliant book.
Yeah.
Hey,
No,
Joel Bellis was the founder, right? Marvin was just a long time editor.
Okay, yeah,
sorry, Mark.
I might be mistaken there.
Yeah,
Yep.
Mark, you've got the history there. But yeah, okay, very good. Those are all publications we should really consult quite regularly.
So my career is sort of divided between frontline pro-life activism. I'm communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, and then cultural analysis, which I do for a wide range of publications, and then also I've had the opportunity to write a number of books, which has been an enormous privilege. And so to kind of take a look for a minute at the subject that brought this discussion about.
Right.
One of the really interesting questions that I think everybody's struggling with is, first, how did we get here? And then second of all, what do we do now that we're here? And I think one of the first important points to make is that the culture war, as we previously understood it, has been lost. By which I mean that the mainstream of the culture is lost. It is no longer Christian in any sense, and we are not going to be retaking Hollywood or retaking the corporations, and in most cases, we will not even be retaking government in a significant way. And so I think that's important to recognize, although there are many cultural battles worth fighting. And that is essential. Obviously, I believe that the pro-life movement is simply the organized response to Christ's command to love our neighbor as ourselves. Preborn children are killed at a rate of 300 every day in Canada. And as Francis Schaeffer once said, every abortion clinic should have a sign in front of it that says, "Here by permission of the church." And so I believe that abortion for me it's an emergency that restarts every day when the clinic's open.
Right.
And what our organization and other pro-life organizations do is attempt to intervene in that emergency. And to do that, both to save babies who are scheduled to die, but also to persuade our neighbors that abortion does kill a human being, and that this matters in a very significant way. And so there's individual cultural battles that we need to fight, but we have to recognize that essentially we have the battles that we engage in are divided down to two categories. And the first category is offense. And the offensive battles that we are fighting in Canada, at least in the current state of affairs, are primarily battles of what I call harm reduction. And so by harm reduction, it is whatever policy we can get, whatever cultural shift we can facilitate to save babies, saving babies, each one of them precious lives, unrepeatable lives created in God's image. Every person we can dissuade from committing euthanasia is a life saved. If we can convince the government to ban MAID for mental illness, then this is a huge victory that will protect the lives of the vulnerable. When it comes to trying to restrict, for example, transgender surgeries or puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, we are genuinely sparing those children from damage. And so do I think that we have the numbers here in Canada to facilitate a cultural shift that will restore us to a biblical understanding of gender? No, I don't. 89% of Canadians attend no place of worship regularly, which means only 11% do. Within that 11% is contained Muslims, practicing Jews, Christians ranging from Reformed and Catholic all the way to the United Church, which is essentially the NDP at prayer. And so that 11% is not indicative of the amount of people who might support the socially conservative agenda that I presume those of us on this call would. And so in terms of the offensive cultural battles we fight, I see those battles as harm reduction in every way we can. It's part of the commission to love our neighbors as ourselves. Right. The defensive battles that we fight are to preserve the communities that are necessary for us to pass our faith on from generation to generation, and then hopefully to expand those communities through evangelization. And so those battles would include defending religious liberty everywhere that we can. In the United States, they have a much better track record on this because even their progressive justices have largely voted in favor of religious liberty. Whereas in Canada, we have an incredibly radical Supreme Court where the justices regularly trash decades of their own precedent. I've been told by lawyers when we're discussing our own work here at CCBR, I can't give you a good estimate of whether or not you can win, because I used to be able to tell you, here's the precedents say, and you're likely to win based on these precedents. He said, now, for all we know, we get a judge who simply says, this is the law now, which is why after the Supreme Court repeatedly repudiated euthanasia, they changed their mind and voted 9-0 instead to bring in euthanasia. And I think it's important to recognize that those justices were appointed not by Justin Trudeau, but by Stephen Harper. And so this is just kind of gives you a glimpse of how bleak the political landscape is that many of the worst judicial decisions that we have in Canada that profoundly affect the way that Canadians live, but also the way Christian communities function, have been passed down by justices appointed by the last Conservative Prime Minister that we had. So in the defensive battles, this involves having what we call thick communities surrounding churches. This involves educating our own children, whatever the cost. That means homeschooling, that means classical schools, that means independent Christian schools. What it does not mean is public schools. Public schools exist essentially to transmit the ideology of the state. When my mother went to a public school, they opened the day with the Lord's Prayer.
Yes.
Now kids are taught that there are dozens of genders, and it is the standard public school practice across the board not to tell parents if you're transitioning. And our political regime has been so radicalized that when New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs said, you've got to tell the parents if you're calling their son a girl, that was, according to our prime minister, according to opposition leader Jagmeet Singh, this was considered radical instead of common sense, which just gives you an idea of how much the Overton window has shifted in 9 years. So I would say we have two primary responsibilities. One, our cultural battles of offense, in which we seek to love our neighbor by reducing the harm done to our neighbor by the post-sexual revolution society that we all live in. And the second of all are battles of defense, where we preserve the communities that both serve to be safe places for our families, safe places to raise our kids, and to also accept the refugees that the sexual revolution is producing, because revolutions only bring misery and death, as we know. Our revolution has brought 4 million dead children killed in the womb since 1969. It has brought a host of children who have been mutilated by an ideology that every single day is proven to be more bankrupt by the academics who examine it. It's been banned in several countries, despite the fact that our prime minister refuses to even address that fact. And so we need a twin response. And then I think that one of the things that we also very much have to keep in mind is we have to keep in mind that we have had the fortune of living in a society that is functionally an aberration. The society that was established after the Second World War, a society in which we were all able to be more or less prosperous, a society in which we could practice our faith freely, a society in which we took many rights for granted. That's not the society that we live in anymore, because we've removed the foundation of that society. We've sawed off the branch that we're all sitting on. And I don't claim to have any great insights into precisely where this is going to end up. I can make individual predictions, but what I think we are in what's commonly referred to as a pregnant widow moment. The old order is dead, and we do not yet know what the revolution will give birth to as the new order. We just know it's not going to be the one that we've enjoyed since 1946. I often think about the fact that my grandmother, who is still alive, was a teenager when she hid in the basement of their home in Rotterdam while the Germans leveled it. Right. And the fact that her experience is actually far more similar to the experiences of human beings across the millennia than the experiences of myself, who was born in 1988 and has never seen the kind of world that existed before the wars, but that may come again. And so this leads me to one example of that cultural shift that was focused on in the email Donald sent out, and it was based on an essay that I wrote for the European Conservative. And that essay focuses on the collapse of cultural Christianity and what's taken its place. And what's sort of very, very interesting to me is that year over year, all this data would come out, not as much in Canada because Canadians aren't particularly interested in it, but in the States especially, emphasizing what was referred to as the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. There's hardly any more of those. And essentially, what was interesting to me is that you would suddenly see these like 5% spikes in people that were identifying as having no religious affiliation at all. And those numbers, just the jumps seem to be far too large to be able to attach to any particular phenomena, even a society that's being incrementally changed by the ongoing sexual revolution. And when I dug into the numbers, what I found is that the vast majority of people identifying as Christian were identifying as Christian for purely cultural reasons. And so if, you know, you were, your family was an Italian Catholic, you might not have darkened the door of a church since First Communion, but you would still refer to yourself as a Catholic. There's a really funny story by Rod Dreher, who talks about when he converted to Catholicism, his dad said, but we're Methodist. And he said, you never took us to church. And he says, the Methodist church is the church I don't go to. Which is to say, the Dreyers have always been Methodist, and we are Methodist, and I think that story kind of encapsulates the way that religious identification was a cultural identity that didn't actually reflect people's actual lives. Although often their values, their general values, get married, stay married, those sorts of things would still align. And so what we were seeing with the collapse of cultural Christianity is not that the churches were suddenly emptying out. It's just that people who had previously identified as Christian for culturally convenient reasons now decided to do the opposite. There was cultural cachet in saying I'm an Italian Catholic, I'm Dutch Reformed, I'm an Episcopalian. But as the sexual revolution took over the institutions, more and more and more, identifying yourself as a Catholic was actually associated with, you know, all of the various inconvenient doctrines that the Catholic Church teaches. And you hadn't been to church in years anyways, it was just easier just to drop that entirely. And so the more interesting data that I started digging into was, okay, well, how many people actually went to church? So if you've got, like, you know, the number of nuns jumping, you know, 5% from 2015 to 2016, what does this look like in terms of practice? And the answer is almost nothing. It's not, once you drill down to people who actually go to church, those numbers were fairly stable. We're going to see what those numbers look like post-COVID, because COVID threw a wrench into things, and it was sort of an apocalyptic event that may change things quite significantly. But to my key thesis, backing up, it's just what you saw is that Christianity was the cultural power. It was the accepted norm. You know, in God we trust. You know, on the money. Without a vision, the people perish, carved onto the Peace Tower of Canada's Parliament. Right? Christianity was sort of the collective cultural identity, and even if you didn't believe it, you still genuflected in its direction. But as the sexual revolution became the new power in Canada, that would be the country that developed between the two Trudeaus. From the state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation to, if you're not applauding what goes on in the bedroom in Main Street, Toronto during Pride Month, you're a bigot. This has just led a lot of people to say is, why identify as a Christian when it's only a pain, right? I don't go to church anyways. I haven't believed that stuff in a long time. I couldn't tell you what I thought of the resurrection if you put a gun to my head. So what's actually the point? And then synonymous to sort of the rise of those with no religious identification, you see a corresponding spike in those identifying as LGBT. And here again, the headlines don't actually give you the interesting story. So when I wrote The Culture War in 2016, what was really interesting to me is that the gay rights movement used as its primary argument the Kinsey reports from 1948 and 1953, human sexuality in the human male and human sexuality in the human female, that essentially stated that there were 1 in 10 men were homosexual. And so, you know, this, you know, 10% of the population is gay. This really, you know, drove the gay rights movement. Everybody knows somebody, that sort of thing. The reality is that in both the US and Canada, the number of people who identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual never broke 3%. In 2016, the Canadian national poll still said 3%. And so even in a society that had openly embraced and celebrated these sexual lifestyles, even in those societies, we were still 7 percentage points shy of what Kinsey said we were in the 40s, which just gives you an idea of how thoroughly the sexual revolutionaries lied and just simply made up their data in order to shape the public consensus, right? There's that old saying in politics, you don't take polls to tell you what the public thinks. You take polls to shape what the public thinks, because people want to go with the majority. But now suddenly, in a handful of years since then, so in the States, it would be after Obergefell and the legalization of same-sex marriage. In Canada, it would align with the premiership of Justin Trudeau and the radicalization of the Canadian government on every sexual issue. We don't have Pride Month in Canada, we have Pride season. The Canadian government formally recognizes a 4-month Pride season, all of it funded by your tax dollars. And what we saw is suddenly double, triple. Suddenly, the number of people identifying as LGBT was spiking through the roof. First it doubled, then it tripled. In some states, it's between 21 and 24%. But when you drill down into the data, the very interesting thing, once again, is the number of men who want to have sex with men and women who want to have sex with women is relatively stable. Not much different than it was a decade ago. But the number of people who identify as LGBT is through the roof, because now there's 72 different genders. You can call yourself queer, which means it used to be a pejorative. Now it means essentially nothing. If you call yourself queer, you have not given this person any useful information as to your orientation, your identity, or anything else. It just means you don't want to identify as straight because that's boring. And so it's interesting because one of my writer friends was a gay rights activist back in the 80s, and he thinks this whole thing is ridiculous. He's like, you know how hard it was to come out? Now everybody's, marching under our banner, but none of them are doing the hard work of struggling with the fact that, your identity doesn't align with your body or whatever. And so this is kind of what we're seeing now, is that the number of people who are engaging in the practices that they were 10 years ago is roughly stable, although pornography has changed it somewhat. But the number of people identifying are through the roof. And what is this? Well, this is just a shift from cultural Christianity as the cultural power to cultural queerness as the cultural power. Now, if you want to get cultural cachet, cultural recognition, you identify with the group that runs the show. And that in this country is the LGBT movement, right? Carl Truman asks, how do you establish an empire? The first thing you do is you conquer time and space, which means that when the LGBT movement has a half of a calendar, 4 full months just for Pride season, they're conquering time and space. They own the public spaces. The major cities get shut down. We fund all of it. And you get a BC conservative provincial candidate got forced out of his candidacy in Courtney Comox earlier this week. Why? Because he said it was degenerate for adult men, nude except they were wearing bondage gear and a leather puppy mask, to kneel in front of a little girl in the street. I want a political culture that says anybody who isn't appalled by that photograph is ineligible for public life. But we live in the reverse world, where somebody who says that's degenerate somehow has to defend himself. And I think the mainstream of Canadians agrees that that's degenerate. I've suggested, I talked to some of these people and I said, like, the question should be, what would you call it? Don't defend yourself and say, what would you call it? And then let the normal average Canadian voter decide what they think that constitutes. Because, Canada's in rough shape, but we're not that bad. As we saw with the Canadian support for parental rights, it's a super majority, it's over 80%. Canadians have not been given the opportunity to vote on these things. So that, believe it or not, is my very short analysis of what we are. And now I would love to have an open forum where we take this discussion in whatever direction all of you would like to take it. Or interrogate any of the claims that I've just made.
No, thank you very much, Jonathan. We'll open up Anne, you've been front and center in the harm reduction area.
Well, and I'm excited to hear you talk, Jonathan, about the current stats. And I know it's very discouraging on one level, but so many of these young people that are identifying, and it's now over 30% in our Canadian public school system. At least that was the latest I had seen. And recognizing that these children are so bullied and so pressured into conforming to this new religion, which I will call the LGBTQ. It is the new religion of Canada. And if you do not conform, then you're going to be sacrificed on their altar, right? That is the way things are happening in Canada. But the reality is, as you said, Jonathan, that the actual practicing of homosexuality or lesbianism has not grown. Like, it's still at under 3%. It may be just a little bit over. And I want to suggest that there is some hope in that. I know it seems so hopeless, but if minds can be changed and hearts can be changed through such slanderous propaganda and media campaigns, then I mean, I'm always the eternal optimist, but Jesus can change the hearts and minds. And what we're seeing, what I believe we are just on the cusp of seeing, is a new revolution. I believe that so here's my caveat
Yeah.
with this, Jonathan. I've
Yep.
kind of not given up on the church. I want to shake the church, the whole uh, organization. Doesn't matter
Yeah.
what denomination or sphere of it you belong to,
Right.
but wake them up. But you know, God has his way anyways, because after the freedom movement stuff started, what I've watched since the truckers convoy lit on Ottawa, and I was there and I watched what was happening and was part of that, and I began to see right in that moment that there is hope, because the average everyday parent does not want to see what's happening to their children happen to their children. And I think in my perspective, I want to work with Christians, but I will work with anyone that has the children's best interests at heart, and that comes right into this element of the LGBTQ and the indoctrination within the school system that we've just watched, which of course all comes right out of the Kinsey playbook, like you said, Jonathan, Kinsey and Pomeroy. And I don't know if you are aware of this, and I'll stop talking. I'm sorry. But just this week in Australia, you've probably seen the thing that's been going around about Australian students from the public school system, I think grade 9, being taught about bestiality.
Yeah.
And everybody's in a big kerfuffle, and I'm thinking, I've been talking about this for years, but I mean, you just have to look back to Kinsey and then his associate Pomeroy, who both said that anything that is not that you actually could not actually perform, that might not be acceptable, but anything else is totally acceptable, including bestiality. So
Which they claim 20% of rural folk engaged in.
oh, I'm sorry. So here, you might not like my language. That's BS. I live on a
I'm quite
farm.
well aware. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah,
having grown up in the country, I don't mind that language at all.
That's mild.
well,
That's right.
yeah. Anyways, but you know, so I'm very excited about what you're doing, because I see us as a conduit to bring truth to the masses. And right now, Canadians are positioned for truth. I believe
Yes.
they are being positioned for truth. They're not the Christians. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about Canadians. And if we are not there on the forefront supplying the truth, then they're going to go searching other places.
Yep.
And the church needs to be
Well,
there. They're looking for it.
And the example of that
Well
is Jordan Peterson, right?
Oh,
Like people
right.
like, oh, in Canada you can't say this. I'm like, Jordan Peterson said he wouldn't use preferred pronouns, and he got rich and famous.
Yeah.
So if you need a Canadian example, there it is. But I want to respond to a couple things you said, because I think you're bang on all those things. I think when it comes to the church, the first thing to remember is that the church has never accomplished anything Christians have, and the churches have always followed individual Christians, like that guy Granville Sharp. People say, oh, it was the churches that ended the slave trade in Great Britain. No, it wasn't. It was 13 guys who met in a tiny bookshop on St. George Street one rainy night in 1787. Those people mobilized a massive army of Christians who came out of the churches, and their pastors followed. At the end of the day, every major movement that fought for social reform has been fueled by Christians, has rarely been fueled by the institutional church as such. And so we should just get on with the work of following God's command to love our neighbor, and the rest of them will follow. I don't think we need to wait for that. Second of all, to your point of Canadians being ready, you're not only right, but that assertion exposes the primary barrier to anything happening in this country. And that's the fact that when the transgender movement began to transition the country, they made eunuchs of a lot of our parliamentarians at the same time. Because at the end of the day, people are like, well, we can't talk about this. And I'm like, no, the reality is that you won't. And so the 65% of Canadians in the mushy middle who haven't lost their minds don't have a voice, period. The reason we suddenly have parental rights policies unfolding across the country, I was writing 10 years ago, and I'm sure you were writing a lot earlier than that, saying most Canadians don't support this. Like, if does anybody want to pick up this crown, MPs? Because you're going to have a really, really huge movement behind you as soon as you do, but nobody's speaking for us. And then Blaine Higgs rolled over one day and said, you know what, I've had enough. And that's all it took. That is all it took. One middle-aged guy laying out a policy in an uncharismatic, bland voice and like saying, I'll run an election on this. And then a couple of his caucus members stood up because they wanted to martyr themselves for the transgender industry. And he's like, fall on your swords. And they did. And nobody cares. Their careers are over because, as it turns out, they banked on the LGBT movement's ability to keep them safe. But the reality is that the LGBT movement is a government-funded astroturfed movement that does not actually hold sway over the hearts and minds of the majority of Canadians, which is why they needed it in the schools. They need it in the schools because the schools are the recruitment grounds. And so I'm really glad that Blaine Higgs put lead in everybody's pencil, and I'm really glad that Danielle Smith, who's a libertarian, and I rarely trust libertarians, but they usually just care about weed and sex. And so the fact that she was willing to take a step further on this is hugely encouraging.
Right.
And I hope if Pierre Poilievre is smart, he'll be willing to run the next election on this question. We've got the CAS report. We've got the reports from the hospitals in Sweden, Finland, Norway, studies coming out of France. There's a new study every couple of weeks now. And so like honestly, he could beat the guy like a drum if he wanted to in a debate by saying, I'm sorry, but your policies are deeply damaging the very kids you're claiming to protect. So while you're using trans kids as a political ploy to try and scare enough Toronto progressives to win the election, I'm actually looking at the fact that there are young people in this country who are waking up at age 19 and realizing that their ability to experience sexual intimacy and their ability to conceive children was removed before they were old enough to smoke, drink, drive, or vote. And that's on you, Mr. Prime Minister. So you're right. We could win this debate if we had champions who are willing to actually open their mouth and speak articulately in English.
Now you have a interview, I guess, with Poilievre or on him just recently, in terms of being an authentic conservative in many respects. And is this a point where he would resonate in terms of a political a matter of conviction to really?
I will vote. So I think Pierre Poilievre. So Andrew Lawton, who is the one I interviewed on his new book on Poilievre, and Andrew's a longtime friend. He's a very socially conservative guy. He's very pro-life. We agree on all the major issues. He calls Pierre Poilievre a movement conservative. I think that's a nice phrase for, it kind of gets swept along with the current, and as Chesterton said, only dead things flow with the current. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that he has a certain number of convictions he's held consistent to. And the reason I'm voting for him is because the one thing that he is consistent on, passionate about, and cares about, I've talked to a lot of MPs who affirm this, is he despises euthanasia and genuinely wants to stop it. And as somebody who has a lot of mental health issues that run in my family, I believe expanding the eligibility criteria of euthanasia to people with mental illness is an absolute disaster that will cost us the lives of thousands of struggling young people, middle-aged people. We're going to see suicides go through the roof. I will vote now, not just offensively on that issue. I would frankly vote in self-defense. I would be voting, like, again, depression runs on my wife's side of the family and mine. For all I know, one of my beautiful kids will have it too. And I don't want them to grow up in a country where if they walk into the doctor's office and they explain their condition and they get diagnosed, they're given the option of MAID, which is the regime explicitly that the Trudeau government's trying to bring in. So I'm a one-issue voter this time around, and it's whoever stops that.
Right.
Do you happen to have in Canada, we have this phenomenon with Bill Maher, and where he hasn't changed his liberal stance on a lot of things, but he's come out very strongly against the crazy left. And sometimes you need voices like that, and probably even more so in Canada, because if your conservative element is a much smaller percentage than we have in the US, you've got to have those partnerships. So do you have anybody that's kind of in that range?
Well,
that
you're
you're
gonna-
speaking at?
Yeah.
So you're gonna laugh, but yeah, we have Bill Maher. At the end of the day, Canada has very little in the way of its own independent culture. And as such, by all of the data, the vast majority of Canadians consume primarily American content. Culturally speaking, we're not very distinctive in terms of our cultural consumption, mind you. America, you can't define an American specifically either. Like every state is different, right? Trying to pretend that somebody from Mississippi and somebody from Maine, have the same culture is ludicrous. But we do watch all of the same stuff. In Canada, all of the culture is official government produced culture, which means it's so painfully unfunny that you deeply regret the moments of your life that have fled, never to come again. And so like we don't have like, the other thing is that people who make it big in the culture industry in Canada leave, right?
Yeah.
They go to the States because there's more money and there's more recognition, and they don't lose their Canadian audience by doing so.
Right.
Russell Peters is from Brampton. He lives in California. Justin Bieber is from Stratford. He lives in California, and I'm sure you get the trend.
Well, yeah, a lot of the Saturday Night Live people came out of
Oh, yeah.
Canada.
Oh yeah.
Second
So
City
like
Theater.
I could make a robust defense of Canadian culture in terms of the brilliant novels that were written, none of which were penned by Margaret Atwood. But like
Yes.
we have Alistair MacLean,
Right.
who is just so distinctive.
Right.
No Great Mischief, Two Solitudes by Hugh MacLennan, Wolf
Yeah.
Willow by William Stegner. We've got but interestingly enough, like all of our greatest luminaries were hardcore pro-life and bemoaned the Cultural Revolution. We had the philosopher George Crant,
Of
who was
course.
very anti-abortion. We had Marshall McLuhan, probably the most famous philosopher of media in the latter half of the 20th century, who believed we should be airing abortion procedure videos on TV every month because the Canadians would never accept it if they would see it, and was one of the founding members of Toronto Right to Life. Our Norman Rockwell would be William Kurelik. William Kurelik also painted abortion procedures many times. He actually, one of his powerful paintings is just dead babies laying across the snow outside Scarborough Hospital.
Yes.
And so, yeah, like Canada does have a culture. And if you start working your way down the list of cultural luminaries that haven't been astroturfed by the CBC, you'll find that most of Canada's great geniuses were part of the culture that all of us want to preserve or rebuild.
Right.
Like the great Rex Murphy.
Yes, Rex. Yeah. And I'm glad the National Post gave him his due properly, but the other papers were very pathetic in terms of they really didn't do justice to man.
You could have just stopped after pathetic, but yeah.
Yeah. But
Jonathan,
Mark, yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. Yeah.
A couple quick questions. How do you see immigration affecting all of this, given the rapid change in sort of the demographics, the ethnicity anyway, and backgrounds and religions that have come into Canada?
I'm glad. I'm glad your short question was the most difficult possible question that you could ask, because there's so many different factors to that. So let me see if I can run through them. So, what's really interesting to me is, so when you had people like Kelly Leach, right, who ran for the federal conservative leadership on restricting immigration, which I'm largely in favor of. Essentially, her point was that we have Canadian values and we want those values preserved. The reason I disagreed with her Canadian values test is because I asked her, what would those be? What would Canadian values be to you? And she admitted that like same-sex marriage, which has been around for 5 minutes, was actually a Canadian value. So that test wouldn't just keep out some Hamasnik hailing from Morocco. It would also keep out, like a Baptist from the Philippines. And so it's like, this is the difficulty, is that we don't have any values at all. Like, what are Canadian values? We'll give you a bunch of progressive buzzwords you can string together like Christmas lights, but you won't find anywhere to plug them in. So we've got our bread and circuses, but like the values are something that are different. And so the reality is that when it comes to immigration, the question is not, do we bring people in? Because Canadians have decided to stop having kids decades ago. They just did. That's why I didn't like it when people were talking about on how it's a replacement theory. I'm like, I'm sorry, buddy. Nope. Nobody made you contracept and abort all of your kids unless you struggle with infertility. Childlessness was a deliberate decision for 3 full generations of Canadians.
Yes.
And yet those same Canadians depend on the welfare infrastructure and the social programs that they didn't have the children to pay into to fix. So immigration in a country like this one needs to happen. What you do need to do, though, is pick who you bring in. You need to be picking people who are paying into the system, and you need to pick people who have, at very least, benign values. And I would suggest that this means people from like the Philippines, who actually are largely either culturally Catholic or explicit evangelical, as opposed to people from places of the world that are profoundly disinterested in investing in our society in any way and hold values that threaten it. And let me give you a microcosmic example that is actually a car crash of everything we've just discussed so far. In September of last year, there was the million person march for kids, right? This was organized primarily by imams from Calgary and outside Ottawa. And there was some Catholic and evangelical figures who participated in the planning process. But if you looked at the pictures, these were almost entirely immigrant people. Virtually all of them were non-white people of Islamic extraction. And there was this sort of moment where it was like, oh, actually, like you've been bringing in millions and millions of immigrants from countries that don't accept the post-sexual revolution values. And the only reason the Liberals and the NDP are fans of it is because they know that if they funnel those kids through the public school system, they'll pop out the other end sounding just like a post-Christian kid of European descent, right? We can turn them all into Episcopalians if they give us 13 years. And so watching this kind of pushback was really, really interesting. And there was this moment where I'm like, I wonder if this could be a new majority. And then October 7 happened. And the attack on Israel, and the entire parental rights coalition fell apart in a week, because one by one, all the leaders of the Islamic faction of the parental rights movement basically proved that they would, like, there was no issue that mattered as much as defending what had been done to innocent men, women, and children on October 7. And as we saw, there were spontaneous celebrations of the October 7 attacks, which was an orgy of rape, child murder, and destruction. There were spontaneous rallies in favor of it in places like Mississauga, with a lot of overlap of the attendees of the parental rights marches and this. So, yeah, that's sort of my complex answer. I do think we need immigrants, unless you're going to figure out a way to boost your birth rate, which I think the values have soaked in too far to make that a possibility. I've got a couple of 100 cousins. The Dutch Reformed are doing our part, but besides us and the Irish Catholics, it doesn't seem to be catching on. And so then you have to ask yourselves, well, who do we pick? Do you want to have a culture where primary Jewish schools in Montreal are getting pot shots taken at them twice a week, as happened so far this week? If not, then you're going to have to decide who you want and where you want them from, which is not a discussion anybody in our political class has the guts to actually have openly.
Yeah.
I've got to pop off, but really enjoyed it. I hope to keep following up later.
Yeah. And Mark, I would say the work of Michelle, the whole set on the sexual tsunami and converges very much with Jonathan's. Jonathan, have you followed that work of Michelle very much? I think there's a key element, there's a key alignment with what you're saying and what Michelle.
Okay.
And I'd like to bring that together, I think.
Yeah.
Michelle's in Calgary, and he's got a very powerful message, around understanding the 3 sexual revolutions and so forth. I might put you two together in some format. So mention that to Michelle, Mark, as well. And I will, because I think, Vishal, because he's coming from India with the background, and he's able to present the positive impact of the Bible on our culture in a way that really people resonate with. So I think is a key element, if you will, in the offensive strategy that we need to develop for the hearts and minds of the coming generation. So, well, Mark, I'm glad you could join us, and do give my best to Vishal. And I think Vishal and Jonathan need to talk, because you know that. Absolutely. Okay. Blessings. Yeah.
Jonathan, I'm not sure if how to exactly state this, but I spend most of my time in the investment industry, So I run an investment company, and so you're looking at this whole social disintegration of our culture that you've talked about. That's also bleeding over directly into our economy, our economic situation. And so we're basically sitting in the U.S. Is the same situation, basically sitting on the edge of a sort of an economic collapse, basically, without trying to be too dramatic about it.
Yeah.
We've ratcheted up debt levels to levels that have never been seen in history. We've financialized our economy.
Yeah.
We're printing money like drunken sailors. We're now trying to deal with an inflation issue and so forth. So you put all this together. I mean, I guess one of the things that gives me a little more hope is that all of these efforts, social and economic, are going to fail and fail miserably and lead to a lot of problems. I guess it's sort of in some of those problems where Christians, I guess, maybe they'll be listened to a little bit more in terms of our answers and giving some solutions to this mess, because I mean, it's almost like we're going to be hitting, we're getting close to rock bottom, it seems to me, in a lot of different issues.
Right.
And there's no solutions coming from the left, the wokeism, the socialism, the big statism, if you will, which just wants to grab more and more. And it's going to just lead to complete misery and sort of disaster. Is that now in that, does that give us a little bit of hope that we need to be standing up and screaming and being active and involved? Because ultimately people will, you'd think by God's grace, we'll look for some solutions to some of these issues, and we have them.
I think Jordan Peterson was an example of the fact that people are desperately searching for answers. So one, he displayed courage, which I think really highlighted how many people are desperate to follow something like that. But then second of all, I remember being very curious as to where his huge, so I interviewed him a couple of times.
Right.
When like he first got famous, and I was interested in like, his position on free speech rights, all this kind of thing. And then he turned into this kind of like guru phenomenon. And I'm like, what's all this about? Like, what am I missing about this guy? Right. And it was like, clean your room and do this and do that. And I couldn't figure out why any of this stuff was groundbreaking until I realized that the majority of the people following him like didn't have a good dad like I had.
Right.
And hadn't been brought up with Christianity. So all the stuff that was obvious to me due to the context that I grew up in, other people didn't have. And I'm like, so people are thirsty for this stuff, right? And like the media chucked everything they could at him. And he got rich and famous. They called him every name in the book. He was a white supremacist, a red pill guy, a misogynist. There was nothing they didn't try. And he just got more popular, right? And so that for me was an indication that you're correct, that there's a lot of people that are out there looking for answers. I do also think it should encourage Christians to speak both with courage and with compassion, because one of the things that made Jordan Peterson, I think, also so popular is that he exuded so much empathy, but not facile, flaccid empathy. The kind of empathy of like, I care deeply about your problems and how broken your life is, and here's what you need to do to fix it. And so on the Christian side, so often we either show this sort of facile and flaccid empathy, which is why we don't sing, like hymns anymore. We have all of these like praise and worship songs that, quite frankly, is impossible for four guys around a campfire to sing. And it's just like this. There's sort of a feminization of everything that just doesn't make guys go anywhere. The second thing is that the Christians who are trying to speak boldly, kind of confuse this like brazen MAGA thing, like that's sort of what courage looks like. And I'm like, no, like courage isn't just being a jackass because you can get away with it, right? Courage, like Peterson fused courage and empathy in a way that I think explains his success. Whereas when you've got a pastor who's like, I'm going to get political and trash, Trudeau or go big in for Trump or whatever, like that's trolling and courage are not the same thing.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think Peterson actually provides a good model, is because he had this very masculine energy and empathy combined with courage, where he proved, I'm willing to take the consequences. I'll lose my job. I'll lose my license to practice. I'll get fired. If he'd gotten fired, everybody forgets that he didn't know he was going to get rich and famous when he took the stand. If he'd lost his job, he just would have been like another canceled person we all forgot about by the following week, right? Yeah. It was a real risk to what he did, and that was what attracted people, especially young men, to him in the first place. Second answer to your question is that there are a lot of people already doing what you're saying. And so interviewing for book reviews, one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of intellectuals who are part of the new atheist movement that was really surging when I was in university doing my bachelor's are kind of defecting. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was one of the world's most famous
Of course.
atheists.
Yep.
She's recently converted to Christianity, much to the devastation of her good friend Richard Dawkins. And it was interesting. Neil Ferguson, probably one of the top 5-6 best-selling historians in the world right now, is also, he told me in an interview, he doesn't call himself a Christian yet, but he has returned to church. He's begun to go to church because he feels like he needs something like that. The philosopher Roger Scruton couldn't bring himself to believe in the resurrection, so he just started to go to church, and he said he did so to hope that practice made perfect. It was sort of he lived out the prayer, I believe, help thou mine unbelief, and just decided to go to church instead. But there's a bunch of them. Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve, agnostic, says without a Christian revival, the U.S. is over, and that he hopes people become Christian. Richard Dawkins, in a recent discussion, said that he's now on Team Christianity because he realizes without it, the society that allows him to trash Christianity won't exist. So after 35 years busily sawing off the branch he's sitting on, he's having second thoughts. So there's a movement amongst intellectuals, I think, who the brutally honest intellectuals are willing to admit something's going on here. Do I think it's enough? No, like there's people who call it a revival. I think that, that is far too premature. That's a lovely prediction, but it certainly isn't an analysis, I think, at this point. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. You get characters like Russell Brand too, who basically tried everything and searching into the Christian faith. And again, we don't know the extent of that and so forth. You're quite right. We need to continue to pray and continue to be active. That the Lord actually does work in these people and saves them. They come to a true saving knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, it's, by your fruits shall you know them, right? So I guess that's why we should be cautious and keep our mouths shut, because I don't think a public platform is healthy for somebody trying to figure these things out, as was very obviously true for Kanye West.
Why is the serpent harmless as doves in terms of applying? But I think one key area is the whole cosmology. That is the whole evolutionary theory is really proven to be, it just isn't supportable. It is not in any way defensible. And the return of the God hypothesis, or the work that Myers and others are doing out there, I think there is place for Christians or thoughtful persons in any discipline to take the initiative and say that the standard cosmology that we've been fed simply doesn't hold up. There's an incredible intricacy, awe, wonder about creation. There's, that changes everything when you live in a created world by compassionate, all intelligent being. And I think science, the more you know, the more you're pointing in that direction. You can't undertake and examine anything without seeing, just being awed by the intricacy.
Let me pull it up for a minute. There's a quote that I lead the epilogue to my next book with that you'll enjoy, that summarizes what you're saying. It's by Robert Gastro, and he says, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries."
God and the astronomers, that was. But I think that, the Christians have been sort of by default acquiesced in the dominant evolutionary narrative, but then they'll Christianize it or have theistic evolution, this or that. But the dominant narrative of our cosmology is simply bankrupt. It's totally, it is going nowhere. And I think there is a real potential for cultural renewal through a whole regaining of the high ground of the cosmology. If you don't have the cosmology, you don't have the high ground in any cultural conflict. So I think that's something to watch as well. But I think one aspect is just getting there's so many good Christian works and initiatives, and you're involved in many, but we're still kind of fragmented, or not really operating as a whole in some respects. That is, there's I think it's still perhaps very early, but there is certainly a Christian resistance. I think a Christian renaissance. I think the Nick Ellis and his whole Christian Halls movement in the States, now coming into Canada, really is quite promising, for the coming generation. Of course, you have there's, Aaron Wren and the work he's doing, and others, just, and you talked about, I guess, I think it was thick community or thick, like, they really, to work locally to build our community, and that's the early church. I mean, really, it was those local churches, communities that really were the basis on which they were able to pick up the pieces when the Roman Empire disintegrated, and the family particularly. But I think the technology, to the extent that we still have access to it without it being the censorship and so forth, there is a potential to really bring together a much larger movement of Christians in ways that we can collaborate and have an impact, or choose our perhaps struggles wisely. And I guess in that regard, the education front seems to be one that's really important for the coming generation. Have you, Jonathan, had much interaction with Nick Ellis and the work that he's doing, or is that new?
Not Nick Ellis, no.
Okay,
Aaron Wren quite a bit, but not Nick
yeah,
Ellis.
Aaron Wren's very, I think important in this regard as well, and innovate. And he brings in the technology, the self-sufficiency, freeing yourself from, that just as really strategic elements. David Haskell, who was at the ARC conference back at the end of the year, did have an interesting talk for us on, it was called The Elephant in the Room, but Christianity and the Peterson's ARC conference. And there was a hesitancy on the part of Peterson and those within his kind of inner core to really embrace and take that step to really see Christianity as the real source for renewal and restoration. There's sort of a gap there that they couldn't overcome.
The Bible frequently talks about how difficult it is for intelligent people to believe. Exactly. And I think that if like listening to Peterson early on, he has so thoroughly bricked himself up in his Freudian, Jungian, Darwinian tower that it is, I think there's a lot that he has to give up to accept the historical premises of Christianity. And that's kind of what he's grappling through, because it will cost him a lot where he values things the most, which is intellectually speaking, which is why he has managed to come up with every possible explanation for the Bible stories, except for what they literally say.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't even like, what does that mean? I'm like, it means he was dead and then he rose again. That's why. But like, what does it mean? I'm like, I'm giving you a historical statement, not a metaphorical, mythological, or classical statement. Like,
that's part. And Michelle and he had some collaboration on the whole Bible project, and Jordan Peterson was certainly very impressed by Michelle's account of the impact that Christianity had on Western culture. But that gap is really never to get over, in terms of that there are fundamental truth claims. I mean, a bit like Paul in Athens, there are fundamental truth claims that are very hard for someone who's intellectually committed to a different worldview to embrace. But I think that's a matter of prayer, certainly, in terms of Jordan Peterson. I think there's a lot going on there in his life. The fact that he went through such intense suffering and almost died through his physical, I think, definitely had an impact on him as well. And his wife and his daughter certainly are, I think, more involved with Christian faith anyway. I'm not sure the exact details. But other comments or questions? I think Jonathan has been extremely valuable. You have a very impressive way of just making your points and painting, really painting the picture quite realistically as to where we are. And then that is a point at which some more creative thinking as to how we can engage your country. I think the offensive defensive strategy that you mentioned is a good way to think of that too. But I think building up, as you say, those 6 communities locally, we really can have trust relationships that we can work to bring hope, really, in a situation that is, for many, and Anne, you diagnosed, I mean, the rate of suicide and all the anxiety that's going on for youth and adolescents. There really needs to be a message of hope for them as well. Jonathan.
We
Yeah, just not to take it into I don't know, a different area, but sort of this Gnostic approach, obviously the attack on the body, the trans, the whole, trying to, say a man can become a woman and woman a man and so forth. The billionaire elites, technology elites anyway, certainly are pushing for a post-humanism, if you will, world. How do you see sort of that whole push, Jonathan? I mean, there's the amount of money that's going into basically completely rejecting humanity, who we are as human beings, not just cutting us up and giving us drugs and emasculating us from a hormonal perspective, but literally doing away with the body and uploading our brains, this whole agenda from Google and Gerswell and all of the characters there. Where do you get a sense on where that is going? Anyway, it's a big, I know that's a big issue too, but
because I can't be concise on that question, I dropped a link where I address it in the chat.
Okay. Excellent. I'll make sure
how a handful of billionaires created the transgender industry, and it gets to the heart of precisely what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's good. And I do in 2 weeks have Julie Miller speaking on transhumanism and the metaphysics of the human person, his book. But she'll be speaking on that 2 weeks today. But that's important. Of course, Nancy Pearcey's Love the Body and her work has been certainly affected there. But you're right, Jonathan, the amount of concentrated wealth that's gone into a dystopian view of reality is disturbing. That's partly what Metaxas addresses in the book Religionist Christianity. He talks about this emergence of God of malevolent power, really, and looks at it, apocalyptic terms, in terms of that much concentration of power within the hands of a few. But he does end in I think, an optimistic way. But he keys his whole study off of Bonhoeffer's witness in dealing with the Nazism. And I think our situation is far worse than what was there in Germany in the 30s. Just in terms of, but very helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
Agreed too. And Jennifer Bilek with 11th Hour does a great job. Like, she's done a lot of work with these exposing these billionaires. And
the link that I dropped is an interview with Jennifer Bilek that I did.
Okay,
awesome.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a couple others I'll share as well when I send out the chat. Yeah, I think that's.
And then there's Laura Aboli.
Yeah, she's
UK, and I just actually listened to a short video that she recently did, and it was really so well done, not pleasing, but it certainly is there. And I just think of all of the things that how we've been so set up for 70 years, just like you've been saying, Jonathan. I think that's all together in all of this. One thing I wanted to mention, I've just done a draft paper on pure attachment and the destruction of our children that I'm doing a workshop in June on. But I really think that as we look at the whole education system, and this is what Michelle's doing, and the whole thing needing to collapse, just like I believe that our government needs to collapse. All the parties. I don't think there's anything sustainable. I mean, it'd be nice. I'm not saying that there are not some good, hardworking Christians, so hear me out, but the government as a whole and whatever will be raised up, I mean, that's looking in the future. But I think we just have to continue. I mean, I feel like I'm at a very grassroots place, working wherever God opens the door, but and kind of robbing the children back from the enemy, taking them back to where their rightful place is, and educating parents. And I think, while all the government stuff and everything worldwide is so important, we end up, really in our own world and our own spheres at a very grassroots place. Like you said, loving our neighbors and loving them enough to
Yeah.
really share the truth, and that means even our families. And so
Yeah.
I really appreciate this today. Thank you, Jonathan, for all you do. I'm avid
Very much.
reader
Back
of,
at you,
of
back
your
at you
stuff.
as well.
Yeah, and
It's
yeah, I think, I mean, to be informed, and you know, I guess it's in Lamentations, in much knowledge is great sorrow, and learning is much grief, or something to that effect. But I think it also is the path. You know, think of the sorrow that Christ felt in the world that he moved, and knowing, you know, the kind of rejection that he was going to face and the suffering that brought, but that his compassion really drove him and sustained him, and to do his Father's will. We need to be in that similar space, and to really have that love for our neighbor, those that are near us, and have that, you know, positive outlook, reclaiming really the high ground in terms of the conversation about who we are and what we're all about. Jerry, I know you are a very thoughtful man as well, and you've been very quiet, and that's good. If you have any comments or thoughts, feel free to share. Or I know you've covered a lot of ground.
This has been very informative and very helpful. You know, I'm thinking one of the issues I'm thinking about is that you know, Jonathan, you've been talking about how Jordan Peterson required some courage to lose his job and his license and the like. We're going to see a lot more of that in a lot more professions. You know, and I have a daughter who's a teacher, and there are fewer and fewer places where she can teach with integrity. And I have a son who's an engineer. It turns out that the main ethics standards for the engineering societies tend to be based pretty solidly on Judeo-Christian values at the moment. We don't know how long that will last, but in medicine and psychology and the like, it's you know, and for lawyers, it's becoming harder and harder to maintain your license and also stand for the truth. And so we've got a lot of that going on. Sure. And you know, the desire to be respectable is probably one of the big dangers that Christians face today, because respectability in the eyes of the world and standing for the truth are probably going to become increasingly untenable. Yes. And so the idea that we have to prepare our children, in my case, grandchildren, to be prepared for persecution and to be prepared to stand for the truth. It's a big job, and you know, it's the work of people like Jonathan and Anne and others that are going to provide the fuel for that fire. So thank you very much.
Indeed, you know, we certainly need each other, and I think to develop and strengthen the network and really be aware of who the good sources of truth and courage are.
Scott Masson's not here today, but he talks about the fact that we can't just deal with this on an issue by issue basis, or a particular problem or a particular institution, but that it requires an ecosystem of supporting parts. And I don't think it's all come together yet, but it definitely, thinking in terms of an ecosystem is helpful. Yeah, that's certainly much on my heart as well. And I think there's a lot of parts in that ecosystem that, when they come together, are something very powerful, very significant.
I think God is doing something. I really do believe he's bringing it together. Just one thing I wanted to share, David Haskell, Dr. David Haskell was speaking at our Anchor Ministerial, where I'm licensed, anyways, on the weekend, and he was just tearing it up, and with all of these pastors, and just basically laying it on the line. And he said, you know, standing for Jesus at one time meant that you'd be thrown to the lions.
Yeah.
And people, and you know, the reality was that Christians understood the cost, and now standing for Jesus, we're afraid to lose our jobs. and
Yeah.
and it was just like you could have, you know, dropped
Yeah.
a pin. But you know, that's the whole thing. And people are so afraid of things that, you know, we don't trust Jesus. We don't trust the gospel. We don't have the courage to
Yeah.
trust the words of Jesus. And it's like, I can't,
Yeah.
I don't want to go on. But anyways, when we get to that place where we truly understand who really is in control, then letting go of the fear is really a whole lot easier. And I think that's where Christians are beginning to rise up. And I want to say this, Jordan Peterson has been a prime example, not as a Christian, but as someone who has arisen out of that whole intellectual network simply because he was willing to say, no, this isn't right.
Right.
And so for all of us, it means that we have to brave the lion's den in a different way. And
Yep.
certainly whatever that means for any of us moving forward, we don't know. But I believe God's going to raise up an army.
Indeed. Certainly.
There's a couple of things here that we need to be aware of. I think Jonathan mentioned the fact that the younger people seem to be more committed in some ways, and I think that meshes with what Carl Trueman says, that you know, the age of the non-committed Christian is ending, and the cultural Christians are ending.
Yeah.
But that also means that in our churches, when we are preparing our young people for life in this world, we have to be much more serious about that. There's a church in Montreal where my grandchildren are attending, where the youth leaders are consciously trying to integrate into their youth program what they've learned from Carl Trueman. About the modern world, and preparing our children to deal with that. I think that's fantastic. Okay. In many churches I know, the youth program is supposed to be, you know, 75% fun and 25% serious, and it's, you know, for 2 hours a week or something like that. We don't go very deeply. But I know that we probably need to, you know, put our kids through 1 or 2 hours a week of classroom time with homework over a period of at least 6 of the teenage years, to really prepare them and to be serious about that, and to have some clear goals, because you know, as somebody once said, we all admire Daniel for being willing to be thrown to the lions, but maybe the real hero was Daniel's Sunday school teacher.
So, no, definitely courage is, and you know, Peter's emphasized about how we are to grow as Christians and being tested by trial, but having courage is a key part. We should wrap. I'm just going to say, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read the book by Metaxas, but it's almost like a pamphlet. Too bad it costs so much, but it has now looks at what the Christians did in the 30s in Germany and how they really failed to address the issues. In a way, he uses that as a warning, but it's really well written and with passion. I wish we had the Canadian version of this, but it's a very powerful book. I'll send the link and the review in the chat notes. In fact, I'm going to have a lot of material to add for chat notes. But Eric Metaxas, I think, has really come out and really tried to address to the American evangelicals the point that really is this is not a time that you can just sit back and wait it out. You have to now come forward and really show your commitment and trust God in ways, you know, that. And he and Ren have collaborated on some things as well. Well, look, I thank you all for your time. very much, and Jonathan, for the passion and really the leadership that you've been giving in key areas in our cultural wars. And I look forward to your coming book as well, and certainly having you back will maybe arrange for a group of leaders to interact with you. And there is, I say, to be a discussion on transhumanism 2 weeks. I'll send that out. But I'm wondering, Anne, you're my go-to person, but can I ask you to close in a word of prayer for us? So we've covered some
Absolutely.
pretty serious territory here, and I think your prayerful perspective would be most valuable.
Yes, Almighty God, I thank you. I thank you, God, that we can look to you for every situation. And Lord, because of a passion for Jesus, Lord, the passion that you put within us gives us courage. Father, it gives us stamina. It gives us a conviction to stand where others may not. And so, Father, I pray you would increase our passion. I pray, God, that you would just so touch Jonathan. Lord, I pray that he is such a light. He is such his passion is just, it just exudes from him. And Lord, his passion for life, for the unborn, for those, Father, that you have called to come into this world and
Yes.
the enemy is destroying. But Lord, for the entire population, as we think of Canada, Lord, would you raise up passionate leaders, passionate believers who are willing to stand in the gap for those who are dying, either physically or emotionally or spiritually. And Lord, I thank you for what has transpired during our conversations. I pray, Father, your anointing, your protection, and your grace go with each one of us
Amen.
in the mighty, mighty name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you very
God
much,
bless
Anne. Bless you, and enjoy the remainder of your holiday or vacation. And I'll send out the chat notes later, which will have a lot of the references mentioned. And again, I appreciate your time, and the Oak Center is just getting on its feet. But I think being able to bring together the right people on key topics is a start. And developing the ecosystem that we all are part of will be an important part of our work. So do have a look at the site. And I think finally, this is where the connection or collaboration with Michelle on the whole sexual revolution would be very powerful. He's going to be speaking on that topic in Red Deer, and he's going to be back in Calgary in the fall. So I think there is some really be very powerful alignment with you two, I think. So we'll follow that up as well. All right. Well, again, thank you for all your time, and John, especially, and blessings, and have a good evening. And we'll talk
everyone.
soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye then. Stop the recording. Yes.